by Ada Buisson, a story told in a church. What shall we do? We are absolutely locked in. Every door is firmly closed, and I believe it is the doing of those dreadful boys who have been trying to frighten us out of our wits all the afternoon with their ghost stories. And Katie Bernard came laughing back to the spot where we were all standing and saying farewell words, after going through the pleasant labour of decking our little church with holly wreaths and shining laurel. Katie was blessed with excellent nerves, and a constitution that defied winter snows and summer heats, and I verily believe that she could have curled herself up in one of the great pews, and slept the long night away, as soundly as in her own white bed in the parsonage. But there were others amongst us, and I confess I was one of them, who already longed for the warmth of a fire, and who moreover began to find the glimmering of the white monuments and strange sculptured faces round about weird and a little ghostly. "The dusk is falling. This is certainly most annoying," exclaimed Miss Montam, Ella Willis's governess, under whose charge we all were. She turned a little pale as she spoke, a rare thing for her, for a more self-possessed person than that handsome Miss Montam I never saw. "What? Are you too afraid of ghosts, Miss Montam?" laughed Katie. "Those boys will be delighted then at the success of their trick." The governess turned almost scornfully. "I do not understand how one can fear that in which one does not believe," she said, "but I confess I have a particular dislike to remain in a church after dusk. It recalls to my mind the most painful story I ever heard." And then turning hastily away, Miss Montam herself went and examined every door, even tried the vestry window. Those dreadful boys, however, had taken infinite care to bar every mode of exit, and even Dora Montam was obliged to admit that nothing could be done, but patiently to submit to imprisonment until our absence should cause anxiety at our various homes, and someone should be sent after us. Meanwhile the twilight was momentarily deepening, and to my mind, at least, those half-wreathed pillars, those white faces peeping out from between the dark laurel, those stone figures on the two ancient tombs of Sir Guy and Sir Geoffrey Willis, lying with their legs crossed, began to look very eerie indeed. We grouped ourselves about the seats in the chancel, and for a time talked and even laughed, but somehow, first one voice grew silent, and then another, and at last those grim knights lying beside us were not more silent than we. "Well, I must say, this is a dismal way of spending Christmas Eve," at length sighed Kate Bernard. "We ought to be round the fire now, roasting chestnuts and telling stories." "Telling stories! Ah, what a good idea! Why not amuse ourselves by that now?" exclaimed another voice. "Come, Ella, you have travelled. Tell us some of your adventures." "I? I never told a story in my life. No, ask Miss Montam, she has a gift for it." The governess had been sitting a little apart from us, closer to the tombs than we cared to go, but as Ella spoke she raised her face, which she had been leaning on her hands, and even in the fading light I saw that she was deadly pale. "I could not tell a story here," she murmured, "unless— would you like to hear the one of which I just now spoke? It is a terribly painful one, an awful one, but—" There was a universal interruption of, "Never mind! Yes, yes! Tell us that, Miss Montam." We all knew the strange power the usually silent governess possessed for storytelling. It was the only time indeed she unbent or seemed like other human beings, but when she did condescend to indulge us, she possessed a fascination which none of us could resist, and we all knew that while listening to her we should care very little for the cold or darkness. This was the story she told us. 10 years ago I was 17, and serving my first year as governess pupil at Mrs. Morris's school near Chichester. "No, Ella, you need not look pityingly at me, for I was very happy. Mrs. Morris treated me kindly and fairly, and amongst the girls I had friends whom I loved dearly. Besides, Mount Silver, as the place was called, was conducted on the home principle, and there was not one of us who regarded our existence whilst there but as intensely satisfactory and enjoyable. You may imagine that Mrs. Morris could not have been a very rigid schoolmistress, when I tell you that we even received the news that we should be obliged to spend Christmas Day under her roof, with no greater regret than one naturally feels when one finds the pleasure of seeing dear friends suddenly deferred. The Christmas of 10 years ago was the snowiest I remember. Roads were blocked up, even railways were subject to constant stoppages, and it happened that in our part of the country a small river had been so swelled by the snow as to have laid the surrounding ways under water. So, what with one thing and another, Mount Silver lay separated from Chichester, with almost as many difficulties to be overcome in a distance of 20 miles, as if a hemisphere was between them. Many of us were London girls, and the railway being unreachable, our fate was quickly settled. The only two who remained voluntary prisoners were Millicent Power and her cousin Irene Dupont. Milly Power was the niece of the lady of the manor, Lady Jane Power, who, it was believed, intended to make her heiress, and her home lay but a couple of miles from Mount Silver. But Christmas, or any other Mass, was so dull with Lady Jane, who passed her time nursing her cat, knitting, and physicking her various imaginary ailments, that both Milly and Irene no sooner heard that the rest of us would be forced to spend part of the holiday at school than they begged Mrs. Morris to allow them to do the same. I think we were all glad that they did not desert us, though, perhaps, but I must not anticipate. They were our head girls, our leaders, Milly Power by right of age and rank, Irene Dupont by right of her daring spirit and rich beauty. Ah, heavens, how beautiful that girl was! I see her now before me, with her dark glowing eyes, her oval face, the rich southern blood mantling her cheek with every emotion, so fresh, so eager in her enjoyment of her young life and splendid health. She was cousin to Millicent by the mother's side, but, though daughters of two sisters, there was not a shadow of resemblance, either in character or feature, between them. Millicent was fair, cold, haughty, proud of her ancient family, a little proud, I sometimes thought, of having money always at her command, and being the heiress of her aunt. But I ought not to make any reproach, for she was a kind friend to me, and it was thanks to Milly's purse that my poor wardrobe could boast anything beyond the very humblest attire. How it was that Irene Dupont lived also under the protection of Lady Jane, I never rightly understood. She was not a penniless orphan, I knew, for she often alluded to her father and his vineyards down in the south of France, but yet she appeared to be in a great measure dependent on Lady Jane, and once or twice I noticed that she gave way to Millicent, proudly, but in a manner that betrayed she had a reason for so doing. Were they fond of each other, those two cousins? Ah, that was a question which none of us could satisfactorily answer then, not even I, who was Milly's bosom friend. They sang together sweetly, rode together, but never by any chance were they known to talk together beyond joining in ordinary conversation, and never did I see Irene give Milly one of those gushing kisses which she bestowed so liberally and gracefully on those she loved amongst us. It was not, however, till the Christmas I am speaking of, that I knew the great obstacle between them to be Milly's jealousy of her cousin's beauty. We were sitting in the schoolroom after tea, as merry a party as could be, in spite of our imprisonment, when Mrs. Morris entered rather abruptly, and with not an altogether satisfied expression of countenance. "Millicent, my dear, I want you in the drawing-room," she said, slowly shutting the door. "Your cousin, Arthur Power, has ridden over perfectly desperate at finding the manor house only presided over by Lady Jane, and he declares that the cold is so intense he really can't face it again tonight, and give him shelter I must. Most improper of him to come to a school for young ladies, I am sure." Millicent's fair face flushed, and a peculiar half-vexed smile curved her lips. "Just like Arthur, he is so inconsiderate," she exclaimed, rising with her work in her hand. "He wanted to come down here, but I would not allow that." "Of course not," said Milly, walking rather hastily towards the door. "Ah, Irena, you may as well come too. But Millicent turned almost abruptly, and with a strange forgetfulness of the respect she usually paid Mrs. Morris, she exclaimed, "What for? Arthur is my cousin, not Irena's. She does not know him even." Irena had risen, and was following, but at those words she dropped back into her corner by the fire, and a smile, half angry, half scornful, passed over her beautiful face. "True," she said quietly. Mrs. Morris looked a little puzzled, but even she sometimes gave way to Miss Power, and so, without further remark, she linked her arm in Milly's, and they left the schoolroom. We were not so discreet as our governess, however, and no sooner had the door closed than there was a general exclamation against Millicent, for Irena was the idol of the school. And then the French girl for an instant seemed to forget the restraint she had always imposed on herself, and lifting up her flushed face, with its rich, angry, glowing eyes, she exclaimed, "Nonsense! You forget Millicent is almost engaged to her cousin Arthur. It was natural she should wish to see him alone." "Or natural, you mean, that she should not wish him to see you?" exclaimed someone. But if that was Millicent's wish, she was cruelly disappointed. Mrs. Morris, anxious to make up in some measure for our disappointment, had invited the doctors' and lawyers' families, living in the village close by, with the vicar's nieces, to come and celebrate Christmas Eve in the good old-fashioned manner, and no sooner did Arthur hear of the party than he invited himself to remain for it, and not all Mrs. Morris's hints at impropriety and inconvenience could induce the handsome young officer to dislodge himself. To the excellent lady's intense relief, Mr. Power was a fashionably late riser, and she contrived to dispatch us all the next morning to the church, which we were to assist in decorating before he made his appearance, and I firmly believe, as she watched us all pass out of the garden gate, she thought she had manoeuvred skilfully past all danger, until at least the evening. Schoolgirls of 17 and 18 are apt to talk a good deal on those subjects which good Mrs. Morris dreaded so, but I don't think my mind was ever much given that way, and Arthur Power certainly never crossed my thoughts when once I found myself in that ancient church, with holly and laurel wreaths, waiting to do justice to all the artistic taste we could muster among us. We were soon scattered over the church, which was a singularly beautiful one, though centuries old, it having belonged to a wealthy monastery, and as usual Milly and I worked together. She was not in a talkative humour, and so we spoke little except about the work, and when she suddenly left me, saying she must have a little exercise to warm her, I scarcely missed her. Alas, that she ever took that ramble! She was not gone long, and when she returned she was out of breath. "What do you think, Dora, I have found?" she began, and then suddenly she paused and looked sharply round, for a man's laugh sounded from the chancel. "That's Arthur, let us go and see," she exclaimed. And we did go, and what we saw was beautiful. Irena mounted on a chair, twining a holly wreath round a cherub's head, and there beside her, gazing up and handing sprays of shining green, stood Arthur Power. 2 other girls were near, but it was Irena Dupont on whom those handsome blue eyes were fixed so earnestly that even our approach was unnoticed. "So you have found us out, Arthur, in spite of Mrs. Morris," Milly exclaimed, with a smile on her lips, but oh, such wildly angry eyes. He turned immediately and held out his hand. "Of course, you know I always manage for myself." "So it seems, even your introductions." "As to that, Miss Dupont is a kind of cousin, you know, and therefore an introduction was unnecessary. Besides, I am making myself so decidedly useful that even if I have offended against the Covenant, I ought to be forgiven." "And so you shall be if you will mount and finish this for me," interrupted Irena, and before even he could reply, she had jumped lightly down from the chair and joined another group of workers at the other end of the church. Arthur turned and looked after her rather dolefully, and Milly's eyes flashed. Ah, heaven! How well I remember that Christmas Eve! How joyously it began! How gay we were! I know I can say for myself that never since have I laughed with such free-hearted joy as I did that night. There was little ceremony, no elaborate toilettes. We all knew each other, and the female element considerably preponderated. But the dancing was no less delightful, the smiles no less radiant, the enjoyment no less intense. In the early part of the evening, perhaps, there might have been a little jealousy regarding the attentions of Arthur Power, but he soon showed such evident preference for Irena Dupont that the rest retired from the contest. And who could wonder that she should be preferred? Simply dressed in white muslin, with a sash of scarlet silk round her waist, Irena seemed to float amongst us, like some goddess amongst her attendant nymphs. She never seemed to try to be dignified, and yet she always walked like a young queen, always stood amongst us with her tall graceful form, as superior to the rest of us as Diana amongst her nymphs. It was no use Millicent Power looking cold and haughty. Arthur cared not. He saw only those sweet dark eyes of her French cousin, heard only that rich merry laugh, cared only to wind his arm round that pliant waist. Even in the games which relieved the dance, Arthur contrived always to be near Irena, and though now and then he paid attention to his cousin Milly, even she saw that it was because he felt it a duty, rather than because he wished to do so. I thought I knew Millicent Power well. I thought I understood her reserved character, but that night she puzzled me. She was too ladylike to show temper, or even jealousy, at Arthur's sudden desertion. But now and then she glanced at that part of the room where he was with such wild, pained eyes, now passionately angry, now sorrowful, that even I wondered she could so betray herself to him. Still, she did not keep herself away from the rest. She joined in all the dances and games, and talked and laughed as excitedly as any of us, more so almost, and I recollect that it was Millicent's voice which was the first to accept the challenge, that led to so much sorrow. Our party was too large to be accommodated, even at the large school table, all at the same time, so we younger ones had taken our supper first, and then returned to the dancing-room, leaving Mrs. Morris to entertain the elders. And it so happened that we had no wise friend near to prevent the commencement of as foolish a freak as ever young wild creatures planned. How it was that the subject of ghosts was started, I know not, but I remember that instead of returning to our games, we stood grouped together, listening to a wild story Arthur Power was telling, and though all laughed and declared their disbelief in it, there were few voices that responded to his challenge at the conclusion. I would wager this, and he held up a small gold locket, that not one person here would venture now to cross the churchyard alone, enter the church, and pass through and bring me a piece of the cypress waving over the broken tomb on the other side. What, make the tour of the churchyard in this cold? No, thank you, said one sensibly. "Oh, you may put on galoshes and a warm cloak. Besides, it's a splendid night. The snow is hard as iron." "Ha, ha! I see, ladies and gentlemen, it is the white feather, not the cold." "I should not be afraid," exclaimed Millicent. "As you say, it is a splendid night. I will go." "And so will I!" I exclaimed. "And so will I!" exclaimed Irene. No sooner said than done. Upstairs we three adventurous ones crept to don warm cloaks, and then, cautiously opening the front door, for we knew if Mrs. Morris heard aught of such a proceeding, she would quickly stop it. Not 5 minutes later, I, with the key of the church in my hand, started at a quick pace over the hard snowy walk. It was agreed that 10 minutes after I had started, Millicent should follow, and at an equal period after Irene was to come. For, argued Arthur, the elders would probably have finished supper soon, and it would not be safe to wait for the return of each before the other started. Ah, how well I remember that mad midnight walk! It was a brilliant night, but the cold was so intense that I had not reached the gate of the churchyard, close as it was, before I repented of my folly. However, I went in. I was not of a timid nature, and that walk across the snowy churchyard was not in the least fearful to me. The silence of the decorated ancient church, about which I had heard legends enough to terrify anyone, affected me more, and I confess, as the door grated slowly on its hinges, I felt sorely tempted to turn and flee. I did walk very quickly along the stone aisle, and it was with a gasp of intense relief that I stepped out into the snow and moonlight again, through the little chancel door, close to which stood the broken tomb and its dark cypress. My hand trembled so that I could scarcely pluck the bough, and then I fairly ran along the side path, which led to the other gate opening into the back garden of Mount Silver. "By St. George, you have only been a quarter of an hour!" exclaimed Arthur Power. "I wonder how fast Milly will run. You look rather white, though, Miss Montam." "The cold is intense," I answered rather crossly, and it was a foolish thing to do. "Did you meet the ghost of the monk?" "Never mind whom I met, there is the cypress bough." Arthur shrugged his shoulders and turned away, still watch in hand. 20 minutes, no, 25 minutes. Milly must be having quite a gossip with the monk, he said presently, not quite so pleasantly though. 27. Ah, there she is. Yes, there was Milly, ghostly white and shivering. Arthur approached her almost anxiously, and though he made some joking remark about her having met a legion of ghosts, I observed that he took her hand and began rubbing it, and then muttered something in a low tone, which, however, only turned Milly's shivering into a convulsive shudder. "Give her something hot to drink," I exclaimed from my corner, where I was also still shivering. "The cold, no one knows what the cold of that church is." And then Milly lifted up her eyes with a look. Heaven, how that look haunted me afterwards! And she managed to mutter with her sweet lips, "Yes, the awful cold. I wish to goodness Irene would come now, before Mrs. Morris returns," said someone. "She will be so angry about this." And then Arthur Power looked at his watch again, but this time said nothing. A silence fell upon us all. Not a word was spoken. No one moved even. Everyone listened for that light step which should announce the approach for which somehow we all so longed. The clock struck 1, and again Arthur looked at his watch, and then again that silence continued unbroken, and there, motionless, we all remained waiting for her who was never to come to us. No use our listening, no use watching those slow-moving hands of the great clock. Never, never more were we to hear the fall of those quick light feet. Time might come and time might go, but Irene Dupont would not return with it. Oh, that miserable night! How the memory of it has haunted me! Those sad, horror-stricken faces, which not 2 hours ago had been so happy, the frightened whispering, the coming to and fro of anxious searchers, waving their lurid torchlight over the snow, the sobs, the tears, the wild hopes, and at length the blank despair. How I remember it all, as some dreadful confusion, which, strive as I would, I could not comprehend. A mystery indeed had fallen upon us that Christmas night, a mystery which none could solve. All we knew was that Irena Dupont had gone out, fresh and living, into the snow and darkness, and that she never came back. The path from the house to the church was direct enough. It was perfectly safe. There were no bad characters about. So far as our human ken could reach it, all of us could declare to its perfect safety, and evidence of any struggle or accident there was none. Search was not spared, and for weeks every means of discovering what had become of the lost girl was freely tried. But that solemn Christmas night refused to give up its secret, and the mystery of the beautiful French girl's fate remained still darkly hidden. But, in spite of those great sorrows which come to disturb the current of life, commonplace daily realities must be thought of and faced. I had learnt that lesson in the year of hard struggling I went through, on quitting Mrs. Morris's pleasant roof to take the place of junior teacher in a German school. And yet I confess I felt almost horrified at the contents of a letter I received one June morning from my old friend Millicent Power. She was going to be married to Arthur, she wrote, and she hoped I would come and act as bridesmaid. What? Had she forgotten so soon that horrible Christmas story? I thought. With her usual forethought, she had enclosed a banknote for my travelling expenses, and she made her request in terms which a lonely orphan like myself was not likely to resist. Lady Jane was dead, leaving Millicent sole heiress to her property, but Milly told me she could not endure the solitude of Power Place, and still lived with Mrs. Morris, from whose house she was to be married. I was to go to her there, and I should find more than one familiar face to welcome me. It is only those who are homeless who can sympathize with me in the intense affection I bore to that dear old house and all its occupants, and the eagerness with which, in spite of my weariness, I leaned forward in the coach to catch the first glimpse of the tall, ivy-covered chimneys. I knew the horn announcing the entrance of the coach into the village would be heard at Mount Silver, and I quite expected to see Milly's fair face at the garden gate waiting for me. There was one figure standing there between the rose bushes, but it was Mrs. Morris's, not Millicent's. "No, my dear, I would not allow Milly out so late, though the evening is mild," she answered, after the first embraces were over. "Her health is very delicate, and I sent her to bed." Although Mrs. Morris spoke dryly and almost indifferently, I could detect anxiety in her eyes, and I knew that before long I should hear something of the reason, for I was a favourite of hers, and she had always treated me as a friend rather than a pupil. I found that I was to sup in private with my former instructress, and I was scarcely surprised when, as soon as the first hospitable cares were over, she began abruptly, "Do you know, Dora, I am very uneasy about Milly. I am not at all sure that this marriage ought to take place." I started. "I mean, of course, on account of her health. Ever since that night when... you remember... Milly has been altering in a manner that perhaps others may not observe, but which I have. There is a family malady hereditary to the Powers, you probably know. Consumption. Ah, I have heard that. I wish it were only that," sternly replied Mrs. Morris, as if forcing herself to utter the words. "It is something more awful. Insanity. Milly's nerves never seemed to have recovered the shock of that dreadful night. I was literally too horrified to say a word, and I knew scarcely whether to be glad or not when Mrs. Morris suddenly rose and proposed going to Millicent. I was accustomed to her abrupt ways. Still, when she paused at Milly's door and said in a sharp whisper, "There is a week still to the wedding. We must both watch and do our duty, Dora," I shrank back in alarm. And though that first interview relieved my mind, I had not been 24 hours constantly in Milly's company before I saw that Mrs. Morris's observations were correct. Milly was altered. She would suddenly break off in the middle of a sentence, even about Arthur, and fall into a stony kind of quietude, which was too strange to be the result of mere weakness. Sometimes, too, she was restless, and the anxiety for her wedding day to arrive was incomprehensible and almost painful. She could not endure solitude either, and if by any chance she awoke from one of her frequent dozings and found herself alone, she would ring her bell with a fury which more than once broke the wire. Still, she never permitted anyone to sleep in her room at night, and I was quite surprised when, the day before the wedding, she asked me if I would mind sleeping on the sofa at the foot of her bed. Ah, that Sunday night was to be another of those which terror scorched into my memory. It was an exceedingly hot night. The room was a large one, on the ground floor, and the open window looked into the garden. I could not sleep. Milly, too, tossed restlessly from side to side, and, though she slept, moaned piteously. Time seemed as if it would never move on, and hours seemed to elapse between the striking of each quarter. I suppose, however, I must have dozed, for suddenly I started up with the impression that someone had passed by me, and hastily looking towards Millicent's bed, I saw that it was empty. Why, instead of rushing to the door, I flung on a cloak, and barefooted as I was, darted through the French window into the garden. I know not. It must have been some fate that guided me, for there, dimly visible passing through the little gate into the churchyard, was a white figure. I flew along, but Millicent went faster than I, and with a strength and steadiness she never displayed in the day. On she went, up the little side paths, never pausing, but going on swiftly, steadily, towards the chancel door. Surely now she must pause, unless by some chance the preparations for the marriage had caused the door to be left unlocked. She passed in. Ah, how I flew then, though why, except fearing some horrible catastrophe, I know not, and at length a second time I stood within that ancient church in the dead of night. Even as I entered, a low, piteous moan directed me to where I should follow my unfortunate friend, and there in one of the grim side aisles, where the stone pavement still bore Latin inscriptions to departed monks, I saw that white figure kneeling and moaning, and bruising her soft fingers against the hard stone. "There, I know it is there," she muttered. "I lifted it then so easily, it must come up again. Don't shriek so, Irena. Oh, don't shriek so." And then, lifting up her white, agonized face, she desisted from her awful scratching at the stone, and put her hands to her ears, as if to shut out some dismal sounds. I stood transfixed with horror, not daring to approach, for I saw that though she had her eyes open, she was asleep. But at that moment the chancel door slammed. With an awful cry the sleeper started up, gazed wildly round, and then I saw her fall prone on the stone floor, the life-blood flowing from her lips. There was no wedding the next day in that ancient church. Millicent Power lay gasping away her life, and murmuring only 2 words, "God forgive! God forgive!" But there was a horrified group standing round that stone, and watching for the return of the explorer of the unknown ancient vault which was found under that cracked pavement. There was no need to make much inquiry as to whose remains those were which then were brought to the light of day. The long dark hair, a small ring, told all that was necessary to be told. Irena Dupont was found again. But beyond those words which in her miserable sleep Millicent Power uttered, no light was shed on the mystery which enveloped her fate. I, who knew all that had passed, and had seen the wild agony of her face as she knelt and tore at the stones, felt that, unless insanity could be alleged in her excuse, Millicent Power's soul was loaded with an awful crime, and as I remembered how she had been walking in that aisle when she left me, and returned uttering that exclamation, which was never finished, I joined fervently in that dying prayer of hers, "God forgive." That stone was broken in such a way that a chance glance would more likely have noticed that it could be raised easily than one accustomed to pass it day by day. Probably she had raised it and discovered the vault, and leaving it open had forgotten it until that mad midnight visit. I had passed through the centre aisle, but Irena might easily have taken the side one, but enough of this, it is too dreadful, and God forgive us all. We were all huddled together as Miss Montam's voice dropped, and if there was a word murmured before we were silenced by the sound of steps without, it was only an echo of the prayer with which Dora Montam closed her story.